Welcome to the Babies in Business Podcast. Join your hosts, Rachel and Avram Gonzalez, real-life parents and business partners. Each week on Babies in Business, Rachel and Avram create a space for entrepreneurial parents to find their own way. They'll dive into insights on topics like leadership, efficiency, self-awareness, budgeting, and human psychology as they nurture their family and build their business. Here's your hosts, Avram and Rachel.
We're back this week without a baby in the studio. Things should be a little bit easier to record today. Sometimes August naps have been a little wonky in the morning and we find ourselves having to record. We used to do it on Fridays.
Yeah.
But if he's here, either he can be really excited and be kind of loud, or be really upset and hungry.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes he's hungry, so that means a little bit of extra delay at the beginning, get him fed, and then he's more easy to entertain.
So we're hanging out in the podcast studio with take number 2 on this episode.
The last time was a disaster.
It was, because it really deserves it. I think some people don't realize just how incredible my wife is, my co-host, because one of the things that came up on one of our very first dates, I was just hooked. She told me casually while we're cooking chicken out the back of my Honda Element, we're cooking dinner and it's dark. She tells me, I taught myself how to read. And I was like, wait, what? Can you unpack that a little bit? And she proceeded to tell me that she grew up in a household that just was homeschooled but not educated.
Yeah. You know, they used the label of homeschool, but there was no homeschooling going on. There were resources that my mom had, but there was no one teaching anyone anything. It was more like we had to do it ourselves. So yeah, I taught myself how to read, but I had a lot of shame around that. So me telling you that day was such a big share for me because I had always felt ashamed of the fact that I didn't have an education and that I taught myself how to read, that I had to.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's now us being together for almost 7 years, I think, at this point.
Yeah.
I'm now realizing that it was a shameful thing for you, that you kept to yourself, and that really all of that comes from not wanting to feel stupid.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of my Achilles heels, I would say, is the way that I was raised. It was very, very difficult because we were taught to actually withhold truth so that people didn't know what was going on and that we weren't homeschooled, or that we were, just the whole situation. We needed to shield people from the truth, and we were taught to lie at a very young age. And it was all to save our younger siblings, I have 4 of them, from getting taken away because my parents knew what we were doing was wrong, I guess. And anyway, there's a lot there. There's a lot.
Rachel's got a book inside of her about her upbringing, and she had me read the book Educated at one point, and she said, this is so much like my story. Just change out the details.
Yeah, change mom for dad. Change them around. Change those roles.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we had. You know, there was just a lot. So, yeah.
So the reason that I wanted to start us here is because Rachel started from 0. And whenever anybody tells me their excuses or their reasons for not being able to build the life that they want, I think about my wife. And so I wanted to do this episode today and unpack some of her stories of transformation that allowed her to go from literally having nothing. There's nothing lower than having nothing. And look at where we are now, where we're able to save money. We're able to not have to think about money when it comes to our children and what they need. And although we have big things that we're still working on and working towards, it's just a huge 180 difference from where you grew up. You know, we're empowered by money and empowering other people and other businesses with money today. And before, you were a slave to money.
Yeah, well, and I was also at the mercy of those providing the money growing up. I had no source of income for me, but I was working and I wasn't being educated. So really, it was like, how was I going to succeed in life? And I just knew I always clawed everything out of life that I could. I taught myself how to read because I was determined to know how to read. And I knew that reading would provide me some form of freedom. so that I would know things. Anyway,
Well,
there's a lot to it.
I think that everything starts with determination.
Yeah.
If you haven't decided that you're going to change your money story,
Yeah.
if you haven't decided that you want something different, even if you don't know the how,
Right.
that's your stepping point. Your brother Walker told me this story that he continues to tell it to me, and I love it every time he does. He tells me the story about when you bought candy and then you sold it to your siblings. Something.
I did. I sold a piece of candy for like a quarter at that time, and they bought it. So I was always saving up money for a rainy day because I always felt like there was going to be a rainy day, and there was.
Yeah. So I think that's just like a unique thing that sets you apart from your siblings, but also shows your determination from a young age.
Yeah.
Even though you didn't have necessarily examples to follow about money, and that you saw the lack of and the scarcity of money and fought to never have that as your reality. So as a kid, you just sold some candy, so you had some money of your own.
I always squirreled money away.
Yeah.
I never really spent money. I remember I was young. I had to be younger than 5. Well, younger than 8, maybe about 5. My age guessing in my years of growing up are really poor because I didn't have like anything really
grades to
correct.
Think about,
I didn't have anything to actually link how old I was to whatever that was. Regardless, I remember this one situation where we were in the grocery store with my mom and dad, and I had some money and I wanted to buy some candy, and I did. I bought some candy. And I just remember feeling actual remorse for buying candy. I was like, that's a stupid thing to buy. And I remember at a very young age thinking, I don't want to do that again. I want to have money for a rainy day. I was really young, but I remember that feeling.
That's interesting. I know that things changed in a big way for you, or there was at least a lot of eye-opening moments on the front end and the back end of your first marriage.
Oh, yeah.
So the thing is like you lived with the family growing up,
Yep.
all the way up until the point that you decided it was
I was
time
23.
to leave.
Yep, I was 23.
Right? And so you can share as much or a little about that as you want, but the point is you left your environment
Yeah.
and you moved really far away.
Yeah, I did. Well, yeah, there were a lot of details, but yeah, I moved to Montana. My ex was in Montana, and I moved there, and he really didn't have much of anything, very little money that he was making. He was working at a pallet plant. I ended up getting a job, and that was actually the first step to our relationship's demise.
Well, it was also the first job you had outside of your family's business.
Correct. So it was the very first job that I had had in my entire life because, let's be real, working for my family was not a job. It was slavery. And I had this job, and I was a night auditor at a hotel, and it was terrible hours. But what I got from that was that I brought home enough money to help make sure that our bills were paid. And that was something I grew up thinking that I would never be able to do because I watched my family not be able to pay bills. So I had that experience. And then later on in my marriage, there were these these things that my mom said, if you ever move away and you're outside of our sphere, basically they wanted to have like a compound where we all lived, that when we got married, we contributed to the way of life. And that husband that you marry should have a specific attribute so that they can contribute. And I just didn't love that. I didn't like the idea of that or the feeling of that. And I wanted to love somebody, and I wanted them to love me back. And so anyway, I was out, and I had this job, and I was able to provide money to pay our bills and then some. And then I just started squirreling money away and having money for just a rainy day. Having money for a rainy day is a really, really big deal for me because of where I grew up. We ended up buying a house, my ex and I, and then 4 years later, we sold that house, and we had $40,000 after all of the closing costs and all those things were paid. We had $40,000, and that's kind of unheard of with a 4-year ownership of a home because it takes like 8 years to actually have some money when you sell a home. But then we moved and we bought another home, and we used that money for down payment, all those things, and we still had that $40,000. And then fast forward like 2 years after that point when we bought that house, maybe even just 1 year. And I was just fed up. I had 2 jobs. My ex had gotten fired from the railroad, which is impossible if you know anything about union jobs and the railroad. So he had to work to get fired, but he got fired, and then he wasn't looking for a job. And I was working 3 jobs. I was working night, really awful hours at like this gas station casino there in Montana. I was working at a restaurant as a waitress, and they had slot machines there. And then I was working at a hotel, and I was doing like, cleanup after people's stays. And so I was basically working all the time and not sleeping. And then one day I remember I had been talking to my brother Walker, the one that we've mentioned a lot on this podcast, and there were a lot of things culminating. And, I didn't love that I had 3 jobs, and it was a lot of work for me, and my ex wasn't looking for a job, and we were still making bills, but we were making like less than $1,000 a month. And we were really just taking from our savings that was for a rainy day. And anyway, there's a lot of things that I was feeling. So this one day I go into work at this casino that I was working at, this gas station casino, and they said, so you're going to have to quit your other job. We know that you're working at the whatever it was called. And I was the waitress. I wasn't even touching those machines. But they said, it's in competition. You can't work anywhere where there are slot machines, any other kind of gambling. So it's one or the other. And I was like, well, in my head, I'm thinking, I can't survive with just 2 jobs. Are you going to give me more hours? How's this going to work? And then I had thought back about, or maybe my brother called me that day, and I went into my shift so I'd worked at the hotel, then I went into the casino, and that was when they had told me, I have to make my choice. I had drawn out my till that day, and I went out to the front to start my shift. Then I walked right back in, and I gave the money back, and I said, no, I quit. And I quit all 3 of my jobs that day. It was a Friday, and I moved to New Mexico. I was here on Monday. And that was a huge thing for me. So I gave up everything. I let him have the house. I took my vehicles. I had my motorcycle and my Jeep. But all that to say that I was willing to give up everything, all the comfort that I had, whatever comfort that was at that point, just to have the freedom of having children and having more than just living life day to day. That's a big, long story, but that's
I have some extra insight that I'm just going to put in here because you deserve to know it, the listener. First of all, Rachel was matched up with somebody who loved to spend the money.
Yeah.
So their financial thermostat was set pretty low. What they were comfortable with having was pretty low. So whenever Rachel would save the money, there was a lot of temptation and a lot of pressure to spend the money.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's like one of those things you have to realize in yourself as you change your money story is how much money are you comfortable with having in your savings account, in your checking account. And you'll notice these feelings and these urges to spend, or you'll find yourself in these emergencies.
Right.
And suddenly
when you meet these thresholds.
When you meet these thresholds, right? And so you kind of find out, well, I'm bouncing up and down between here and there. And Rachel and I laugh all the time because the threshold that we had when we first met was much different than it is today.
Oh, yeah.
If we had what we had today in there, we would be feeling that uncomfortability and probably doing some things to self-sabotage. So that's one thing that Rachel overcame and worked through.
Yeah.
That will come up again. But I think also the big thing I wanted to point out is your willingness to do whatever it takes. And in that situation, for you, whatever it takes was, I'm going to work the 3 jobs. I'm going to do whatever it takes. Nothing is below me.
Yep.
It's one of the things I love about you. Nothing is below you. You are not above any task, any calling, any demand of you that's required, and you just do it. And I think the universe shows up and provides. So I just wanted to point that out because most people are not willing to think outside the box like you did.
Yeah.
And they're not willing to walk away from what they feel like is some stability. But like the deal is that stability that you had still was not enough.
It was more like the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. So it wasn't a pleasant situation, but it was a familiar, unpleasant situation.
So you moved back here. We met not long after. And I remember when you got your first apartment.
Yeah.
After we had met. And so Rachel, again, nothing beneath or below this woman, right? She's like, I'm going to do whatever it takes to provide for myself. So she
I knew that I could.
And knew that she could. She did the basic math to figure out how much she'd have to make, how much she would have to pay for an
place
apartment,
to stay,
place to stay, all the internet, the minimums, you know, how much I need for food and things. And she's like, okay, now I know this is the minimum I need when I'm applying for jobs.
Yeah.
So she found this great call center opportunity, worked her way up, got a couple different raises.
Yep.
But you were doing all of this stuff on your own. Now, there were some big transitions that you made with some of your family ties, old friendships, relationships, intimate or otherwise.
Yeah.
Tell me about that transition, because I think that's a big part of what really changed your money story.
Yeah, you know, I grew up very religious. My family was Mormon, and there's a lot of beliefs, but there's a lot of stuff too that, you know, I think was my dad and how he taught that religion to us, because he was the actual teacher of the things, and I didn't have all these different influences outside. I wasn't in school. I wasn't anywhere else. People were not filling my head with anything else. They were the giver of those information. So I think that's important to know. But then also, you know, it's difficult to come from that situation and feel like you have the ability to make choices. So I remember when I was in Montana, there was the first time that I realized that I had not made the decision to not be educated. That was not my decision that I made. It was my parents' decision that they made. And I then enrolled myself in high school online within the week.
Oh, right. Yeah. Another big part of your story.
So that was one of my big breakthroughs. It was probably a year after I got to Montana, and I got to learn from going through that whole program that I was not stupid. And then moving back here, I was back in New Mexico, and there were a lot of family here. There was a lot of my siblings, and mom was here, and the influences were really strong. So my mom died in September of the year that I moved back in 2018, and that really rocked my world. I don't really know why, but I was parentless. My mom and my dad were gone. Dad died in 2016, and mom died in 2018. And I guess for me, it was like there would be no reconciliation. There would be no answers to the things that I wanted to know. You know, why did you choose this over that? And all those different things that I might have questions about. But what I realized about the ties that I had was there was a time when I was telling on myself to a sibling. I was saying something about the choices that I had made recently. And I heard myself saying those things and thinking, I never want to feel compelled to tell on myself again. That was a very family culture kind of thing. And it was in that moment that I said, you know what? I do not want to feel compelled to do anything. I want to know what are my thoughts. So that's in relation to when I realized I hadn't chosen to be uneducated. That was me seeing that mom and dad had made choices and I had made choices, and they were separate things. And then I wanted to be able to make choices and not feel guilty or compelled or any kind of thing, any kind of way about it. I wanted to feel truly free to make decisions and find out what worked for me. So I stepped away from my family. I didn't answer texts, I didn't answer calls, and that stayed that way until after we got married, and it was like 2021, I think. So it was from like 2019, maybe mid 2019 to 21, so maybe 2 years. And it was transformational for me.
Yeah, well, I watched it. I watched you start and from, you know, a relatively, compared to now, contracted, sort of smaller place. You know,
there were so many rules.
Yeah, you were operating inside like a smaller reality.
Yeah.
And then I watched you just kind of crack the egg and push a little harder and crack the egg again and push a little harder until you just became this very different person. I think that what you did was really powerful. You hear quotes thrown around all the time, you know, you're the average of the 5 people that you spend time with. And I think this is a great example of that, because you recognize that the strongest influences on your life were the things that needed to change in order to find your own way.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not about good, bad, right, or wrong. It was just that, okay, everything in my life has led to now. I recognize that there's this side of me that I have a compulsion. I don't even have control over this side of me. Maybe it's time to flip the script. So you did a 180-degree opposite. Your theory was, if I
do what I've always done,
you're going to get what you always get.
Yep.
right? And so you kind of like metaphorically burned the boats for a time and said, okay, I'm just going to be with just me.
And
I
it
can
wasn't
relate to that.
and it wasn't about my family.
No, it's not.
Gosh,
No.
I have 10 siblings and my parents are gone and everyone wants connection. It was hard to be separated, but it was very, very healing for me because I needed to reset. I needed the reset in order to find out who I am and then come back unapologetically me.
I hear you. I hear you. I think we all require that level of transformation in different ways. I remember coming out of undergraduate school and high school with all those same friends. And then I started this project called Inspiraction in 2010. And that really started to change my life. And I started to change. I went into grad school. It's like as soon as I started hanging out with all my grad school friends who, let's be honest, they were going places, right?
Yeah.
It's a different caliber of people. I changed my friend group. It wasn't necessarily intentional at that time, but it did become intentional when my
Sure.
old friends were the crabs in the bucket. And I
Yeah.
had to move on. And then eventually it was like I started my own business and I found friends in the entrepreneur community in Denver. I sort of started to transition away from my grad school friends. These are all transitions for you in changing your money story. You have to change up the people that you surround yourself with and minimize the contact with those who are just not playing at the same level or going in the same direction as you.
And constantly pulling you back to where you were. I think the worst thing that can be said is, this isn't Avram or this isn't Rachel. This isn't the Avram that I know or the Rachel that I know. And I'm like, pfft. In my head, I'm thinking, well, that's a good thing. Because if we always stay where we were, we will never get to be who we could be. That was part of the drawback in my previous relationship. I was always being kept in a box in like this sphere of knowing that my ex knew who I was and I was predictable. And no person is predictable. Anyway, there's a lot there.
Yeah, it's the whole relationship thing. There's a direct correlation between your relationships and your money story.
Yeah.
And I remember going to all these personal development workshops in the 2010 to, for like the next 10 years after that point, where I would go to a relationship-based workshop. And then everybody on the other side is having all of these money transformations.
Yeah.
And then vice versa. People will heal their money story and then suddenly love enters their life in a way that never has before.
Sure.
And I think that's just because money itself is an energy. And when you become more willing to accept more energy, no matter what it is, you stop labeling that energy, you receive it, it changes everything.
Yeah.
And I think that's just something that we saw happen in a really dynamic way with you.
Yeah.
There's a lot. We share a ton of information on this podcast about money, about budgets, about the financial mindset. But I think it's important to remember the key things and the key ingredients that led to, the place where we are now, where we can confidently teach on these things and know that what we're sharing with people is the real deal. It's effective. We've walked the path. And also letting people know that you start at a different place than everybody else. You can't compare where people are to where you are in the middle of your story right now.
Right.
But if you are intentional about where you're going, you have that determination, you're willing to do whatever it takes, you're willing to change things up,
Yeah.
you can have any story you want.
Yeah. Well, and growing up, I felt like there were a lot of things that were outside of my reach, and I was not taught that I could be self-sufficient. I was taught that I needed someone to take care of me and that I was going to be a wife and a mother, and that was really all that my worth was. And I really am determined to be more than just a wife and a mother. While those are wonderful things to be, I want to be Rachel with goals and aspirations and all those things as well. So I think that one of the best things you can give someone that you love is to help them understand that they can take care of themselves. And I want you to hear this. If you want the children that you love, if you want them to succeed in life, they need to know that they can. Because I did not come out of my situation with my family knowing that I could succeed. And I endured 8 years of a relationship with a man that was able to control me through manipulation because he used the same tactics as the ones that I grew up with. I didn't have an opinion about much of anything. And then I met you, and I remember you saying, like, where do you want to eat? And I really didn't have an opinion because I didn't really know what I liked to eat. And you said, well, I'll make this decision for now, but when you have an opinion, I would love to hear it. And you didn't push me to have an opinion because that's really stressful, but you also allowed me to, when that changed for me, to step forward and say it and not be punished for it. Because in my past, I had been punished for standing up and saying that I had an opinion and a preference. But all that to say, when you know where you want to go and you know that you can get there, you can achieve so much. And regarding your money story, when you determine that you are going to make changes and become the orchestrator of your money story, then really awesome things happen. Because like maybe say you have credit card debt, or you have like a business loan, or whatever that looks like, you have these things that maybe loom over you and it's like a monthly payment. What you can do is, there are so many resources out there, and Dave Ramsey is where we started with our story, the 4 walls and how to build a budget, how to construct it with the things that matter. And then you can build onto those things as you have more money or the ability to add other things. But crushing debt is also something that Dave Ramsey is really passionate about, and he has really great steps. And those are the baby steps. And just really cool things. So tons of resources to help you really, truly be the orchestrator of your life, both on the money side, the love side, all of the things. If you want more, there is hope. I changed my life.
Yeah. And it starts with a decision and the determination to follow through on that. Like Rachel said, all the tools are here. But if you're feeling that call, if you feel like there's got to be something else for you,
right,
you can decide that right now that it's going to change. And you don't have to be on the struggle bus to decide that you want to change either.
Correct.
You could be in a great place right now relative to where you've been and still desire and want change.
Absolutely.
But it all starts with you and the demand to have it, the willingness to receive it.
Yep.
And we just appreciate you being here on this journey. Appreciate you, Rachel, for sharing so vulnerably. We will have as many resources as we can muster up in the show notes of today's episode. If you go to babiesandbiz.com/79, the number 79, you can find past episodes that are all about money. We'll curate a huge list of it. You can dive into that, any other resources that we can come up with. We'll share those as well. We appreciate you for being here on this journey with us. If you haven't already, rate us 5 stars on Apple iTunes or whatever it's called now, Spotify. And if you know somebody, you can think of that friend who's just been through it for a while and you know that they're ready for change. Share this story with them. Just take the link, copy this link, share it to them, text it, share it on Facebook, whatever.
Yeah.
They're going to appreciate you sharing this gift of transformation with them. That's it from us for this week.
Bye for now.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Babies in Business podcast. Who do you know that would benefit from hearing this episode? Share it with them and post about it on social media. You can find the show notes for this episode, free downloads, and connect with the rest of the community at babiesandbiz.com. We'll see you next time.